bosun, pipe him aboard.
Aye, aye, sir.
Fire, dress ship.
Very good, sir. Dress ship!
A brief history of man's maritime mastery. Chapter 13. The stately East Indiamen of the rival companies. In the 17th century, a voyage to the East Indies was a grand undertaking, one that took at least 6 months to complete. There was no real need to rush. The Dutch East Indiamen, those proud vessels that helped make Holland one of the richest nations of the era, swung placidly at their anchors off Amsterdam, Hoorn, or Delfshaven, awaiting a fair wind. Tow-headed boys gazed wistfully at these imposing ships, dreaming of the day they might become captains themselves. And why not? These were the ships that commanded respect across the globe, captained by seasoned veterans of the mighty Dutch East India Company, a colossal monopoly with over 100 merchantmen, its own warships, and thousands of soldiers stationed at far-flung trading posts. A captain in the Dutch East India Company was more than just a sailor. He was a sea-going businessman. With the rights to cargo space for personal ventures, he could amass a small fortune over the course of several voyages. The captain knew well how to make the most of this privilege, perhaps by seating wealthy passengers at his table or renting out part of his great cabin. A few successful voyages and he could retire comfortably ashore, his fortune secure. When the weather vanes on the red-tiled rooftops finally swung around to a favoring wind, the plump burghers in their counting-houses would pause at their windows. They watched the men clamber up the rigging, saw the sails flutter and fill, and then the ships would waddle off toward the cold, choppy waters of the North Sea. The burghers would rub their hands together, muttering prayers for safety and another for a profitable voyage. But before these ships could reach the riches of the East, they had to pass through the English Channel, a nerve-wracking ordeal for Dutch crews. England had become a fierce rival in the Indies trade, and for years Dutch and English ships had blasted away at each other whenever they crossed paths. Yet despite these hostilities there was plenty of trade to go around, and France, too, had its share. Once past the Channel, captains and passengers alike could relax as the ships caught the trade winds and swung down the Atlantic. The graceful pyramids of sail stiffened with the breeze, and the ships, apple-cheeked bows treading the blue sea with the dignity of stout bishops, rode southward with a leisurely decorum now unknown in our hurried world. The decks, cluttered with clucking fowls and fatted domestic beasts, often resembled Dutch farmyards more than they did ships on the open sea. Day after day, week after week, the ships pressed on, unhurried. Merchants and officials at the captain's table washed down their ample meals with beer and brandy, strolling the poop deck as they watched the crew work aloft. They observed the soldiers bound for posts in the east, and on an occasional ship the sound of music might float through the air, played by buxom young women hoping to find husbands at Batavia, the company's headquarters on Java. When they reached the Cape of Good Hope, the ships put in at the Dutch settlement of Cape Town for provisions and a bit of diversion. But from there the voyage took a turn. The pace quickened, and the captains stripped their ships for action. Passengers huddled below decks as the ships dropped southward to pick up the infamous Roaring Forties. These wild westerly winds drove the ships headlong across the Southern Ocean, leaping and cavorting through gale after gale. The sailors called it running their easting down, a perilous but time-saving route that cut weeks off the old explorer's path up the east coast of Africa and across the Arabian Sea. However, it was not without its dangers. Ships had to haul up sharply to avoid smashing into the barren coast of Western Australia, a coastline feared for its wild, cruel black savages. Many an East Indiaman met its end on those treacherous shores. At last, turning north, the ships caught the southeast trades, sailing through sunlit seas until the green loveliness of Java beckoned on the horizon. There, the fleet split up, each ship making for its designated company trading station. A salute from the company fort greeted the captain as he moved ashore, while his crew lowered the ship's cargo into waiting lighters. Then the capacious holds were stuffed with exotic treasures of the East, peppercorns, cloves and cinnamon, bay leaves by the bale, nutmegs and ginger, mace and aloes, Parcels of precious stones and bars of silver and gold found their way to secret compartments, while rich silks and brocades from Japan, shuttled in by the company's inter-island carriers, topped off the bulging holds. With hatches secured and farewells exchanged, the ships rendezvoused with the rest of the fleet at Batavia. By October, the fleet was ready to begin the return voyage. Borne on the winter monsoon winds that would carry them back to the cold, welcoming harbors of Holland. Each ship, laden with the wealth of the Indies, sailed for home, knowing that their success would ensure the prosperity of the Dutch Republic for another year. Holland had prepared herself well for the Indies trade long before it became her lifeblood. In the 1500s, she dominated the North Sea herring fisheries, traded actively in the Baltic, and transshipped Portugal's oriental imports from Lisbon to the spice-hungry cities of northern Europe. By the early 1600s, Holland's maritime prowess was unmatched. The sea trade of Europe, a French observer noted a century later, is carried by 25,000 ships. Of these, 14 or 15,000 belonged to Holland. These ships were marvels of efficiency, with simplified gear and minimal crews. Sir Walter Raleigh himself reported that a Dutch ship, 200 tons, could freight goods far cheaper than an English one, employing only 9 or 10 mariners where the English needed nearly 30. Remarkably, the Dutch built nearly 1,000 ships every year, despite having no timber trees growing in their own country. In the late 1500s, the Dutch began to infiltrate the Portuguese Empire in the east. In 1592, Jan Huygen van Linschoten returned to Holland with stolen charts, trade secrets, and the welcome news that Portuguese strength was not as formidable as it once seemed. This emboldened the Dutch to venture further. In 1595, Cornelis de Houtman set off on Holland's first East Indies voyage, making for Bantam, a pepper port on the north coast of Java. Though 2/3 of his crew perished from fever and scurvy, Houtman returned with hopeful reports. Soon, so many Dutch traders had entered the market that competition began to drive down prices, a situation that could not be allowed to continue. The solution was simple. The merchants banded together and organized the Dutch East India Company. Even though the Portuguese still dominated the trade in the East, the Dutch fought relentlessly to push them aside. Spain was temporarily ruling Portugal due to a royal marriage, harassed the Dutch from their base in Manila. But within a few short years, the Dutch had secured Batavia, gained control of the Spice Islands, blockaded Goa, seized Ceylon, Malacca, and Formosa, established stations at the Cape of Good Hope and in the Persian Gulf, and won a monopoly on the trade with Japan. From Ceylon to the Moluccas, Dutch factories rose along the tropical coasts. Here, the company's agents, known as factors, settled in to buy and store the spices, fabrics, and metals of the Orient. Company forts sprang up alongside these factories, and the broad-beamed ships arrived to fill their holds, ever searching for new and wider areas of trade. Abel Tasman's discovery of Tasmania and New Zealand confirmed that Australia was an island continent, expanding the Dutch understanding of the world. Meanwhile, a fleet out of Horn struggled around the gale-swept cape at the tip of South America, naming it for their home port. Known initially as Cape Horn with 2 O's, it was later corrupted to Cape Horn with just 1 O. Although England had chartered her East India Company 15 months before the Dutch, the Hollanders, sailing in greater strength, vowed that the island trade would belong to their company alone. They would not allow any other nation even the smallest part. Frustrated in the East, the English East India Company turned its attention to India, where it traded iron, lead, tin, and woolen for cotton, silks, spices, and gems. Over time, it brought India under its sway, dominated China's tea trade, and outstripped its Dutch rival. For 2 centuries, the ships of both companies plied the oceans purposefully, doing what they were meant to do with commendable efficiency, bringing profit to their owners. And yet, while these stately East Indiamen were laying the foundations of empire, a lonely little ship named Mayflower, freighted with human hopes, would sail across the Atlantic and make a greater mark on history than all the grand ships of the East India Company combined.